Hey everybody. So for my midterm project, I decided to research the homeless issue in New York City. Like other phenomenon, homelessness is a tough issue to tackle. City resources are constantly being spent on preventing it as well as reacting to it. However, like all tough issues, it's best to try and understand the extent of the issue and see if there are any trends pertaining to it. And I decided the best way to do that is to analyze data collected by the Coalition for the Homeless, which is an advocacy group that advocates for the homeless population in New York City and other major cities, as well as the Department of Homeland Services, which is the government agency responsible for the homeless population in New York City. And the Coalition for the Homeless has extensive data on the homeless population from 1983 to 2019. I decided to focus on 2000 to 2018 for the sake of relevancy and complete information. The Coalition breaks down the total population of homeless people in New York City into the total families and single adults. The families are broken down into the children and the adults in the families, and single adults are broken down into single men and single women. This last field here is the average length of shelter stays for families in days, meaning how long are homeless families spending at a homeless shelter. And the best way to get some meaningful and valuable information from this raw data table is to start off by creating a pivot table. And you do that by selecting the table or range that you want. You go to Insert, Pivot Table. Our table is selected. We're going to do it in a new worksheet. Move the sheet here. Call it Pivot Tables. And we'll start off by looking at a decade-long trend from 2000 to 2018. We have our years. We'll get rid of quarters and months. We just need our years. And then we're going to put the total families that are in homeless shelters and how long are they staying, and see if there's any sort of relationship there. You'll notice that it automatically does sum. What we want to do is the average, because when we do sum, it's summing every single month within those years. Oops. Okay. And because it's average, we got some decimals we have to get rid of. Okay, now this looks more like the data on our raw data table. If you notice right away, you see that as the total families are increasing each year, so is the amount of time they're spending at the shelters. And what we can do here is try to make a visual representation out of this pivot table. Go to Insert, Pivot Chart, and we'll see different types of charts. Now, if you want to compare the length of stay with the total families, what we could do is create a combo chart. So here we have a clustered column line. You'll notice that the line is the average length of stay, and because it's using the axis that's being used by the total families, the line is all the way down here, and it doesn't really give us a decent understanding of what's happening. So if we click secondary axis, ta-da, now we have an actual relationship between the length of stay and the average of total families that we can understand. Press OK, and you have your pivot chart. Now we can make other relationships using this raw data table. Select it again, Insert Pivot Table, go to our existing worksheet. And we could also compare the difference between single men and single women that comprise the single adults in the homeless shelter population. So we have single men, single woman, and similar to our last pivot table, we're going to have to switch this to average. Average. And we'll round it off. Okay, so now we see the difference between how many single men there are and how many single women there are at the homeless population each year. If you go back and create another pivot table, we can see how many children, how many adults, and how many adults and families make up the total population of homeless people in shelters in New York City. So we go to months, we'll do years, we'll do children, the adults in those families with children, and single adults. And you'll see that it's sum. We have to change it to average. Average. If we just round all those, there you go. Now we see that these numbers right here make up the total population of homeless shelters in New York City each year on average. And like the first pivot table, we can make charts out of each of these other pivot tables. So for this chart, we'll create a pivot chart. And we'll do a line comparing single men and single women. And we have this right here. And for this chart, what we're going to do is a stacked column chart. Go here. And then this will show us the total homeless population. And of that population, how many were single adults, how many were adults and families, and how many were children. So what I did here is I took those pivot charts we just made and put them in a new sheet called Decade Trends. And this is going to sort of act as my dashboard. What I could do now is get rid of these field buttons here. And just make our charts look a little cleaner. So this is what my decade trend dashboard looks like after I played around with some of the axis titles, some of the designs, color schemes. And if you notice here, what I've added is a timeline. A timeline sort of acts like a slicer in the sense that it narrows down the information to the criteria that you select. And here I did mine by the years from 2000 to 2018. And if you notice, if I were to just change this slicer here, all three of these charts are affected. This is because if you go here and you go to the timeline settings and report connections, you'll notice that each of these pivot tables is checked off. This helps us if we want to just look at information regarding the first half of the decade, or maybe you want to look at information at the second half of the decade. So from these charts, we figure out three things. We realize that as average families are increasing in population, so is their length of stay. We realize that there are more single men than single women in the homeless population, and we realize that single adults make up the least amount of the homeless population. Now, if we want to look at trends that are happening in more recent times, such as within the year of 2018, we could look at the DHS data dashboard. What I want to look at now is to see whether or not certain races or ethnicities are disproportionately affected by homelessness. Here the DHS separates homeless individuals by the categories of heads of households of families with children, heads of households of adult families, meaning without children, and single adults. If I want to make a chart to see whether or not this is true, all I would do is select one of these tables, insert a recommended chart. I'll go to all charts, and the chart I'd like to do is a radar because I feel like it'll show the point that I'm trying to see. Okay, and here we have all these lines overlapping each other because we have every month. We just want for year to date, and ta-da! After making two more charts for the other categories, we see that one thing happens to be the same, that Black, non-Hispanic individuals and Hispanic individuals are disproportionately affected by homelessness. So much so that the scale is tipped much more towards their sides. So through the use of these pivot tables and pivot charts, we're able to make realizations that otherwise would have been hard from just a raw data table like the ones we found in the Coalition or the DHS sites. And that type of information could be valuable to someone who wants to see which members of our society are the most vulnerable to homelessness. And I feel like these pivot charts give a decent understanding of that, whereas we can see families and single men as are some of the most vulnerable, as well as Black and Hispanic individuals. I hope this information could be used to focus prevention and relief efforts on those that are most vulnerable.